The relentless Texas heat beat down upon the serene suburban avenue, yet within the Patterson residence, a refreshing coolness prevailed, intertwined with an electrifying current of anticipation. Balloons in shades of delicate pink and tranquil blue danced near the ceiling, their gentle bobs echoing the lightness of the atmosphere, while colorful streamers cascaded across the living room, adding a touch of whimsy to the scene. A sturdy table, laden with an array of culinary delights, groaned under the weight of meticulously crafted cakes, savory casseroles, and pitchers of refreshing sweet tea. It was precisely the sort of day destined to be etched in memory as a beacon of unadulterated joy, untouched by the shadow of tragedy. Melissa Carter, a woman of 47 years, radiated a delicate, almost ethereal pride as she stood at the heart of the jubilant gathering. Her flowing maternity dress, in a soft, pale blue hue, gracefully concealed the passage of time etched upon her face, casting her in a gentle, flattering light. After countless years of yearning, enduring a series of heart-wrenching disappointments, and offering up silent prayers in moments of quiet desperation, Melissa was on the verge of realizing her ultimate dream, becoming a mother. She would occasionally gently caress her burgeoning belly, as if to reassure herself that the miracle unfolding within her was, indeed, tangible and real. Surrounded by a throng of well-wishers, friends, and family, the air crackled with laughter, applause, and the rapid-fire clicks of cameras capturing every precious moment. To any casual observer peering in from the outside, Melissa appeared to possess all the elements of a life complete, an abundance of love, unwavering stability, and the boundless promise of a new life about to begin. But lurking beneath the surface of this idyllic tableau, a disquieting secret threatened to shatter the carefully constructed facade of happiness, casting a long shadow over the joyous occasion. David Carter, Melissa's steadfast husband of over 2 decades, moved with quiet grace among the assembled guests. Never one to indulge in excessive chatter, David, with his broad shoulders and the unmistakable bearing of a former military man, possessed an innate air of stoicism. He navigated the crowd with a calm demeanor, extending firm handshakes, offering polite smiles, and unobtrusively refilling glasses of punch without drawing attention to himself. On the surface, he presented the image of a devoted spouse, radiating pride as he stood alongside his beloved wife on this momentous day. However, a subtle yet palpable distance lingered in his gaze, a profound weight that remained largely unnoticed amidst the surrounding cacophony of chatter and laughter. Neighbors, bearing gifts adorned with brightly colored wrapping paper and meticulously tied ribbons, arrived to share in the celebration. An elderly woman gently patted Melissa's arm, her voice filled with genuine warmth, and exclaimed, "Honey, you're positively glowing like never before. This precious baby is going to change absolutely everything." Melissa responded with a gracious smile and a nod of acknowledgement, yet her eyes darted almost involuntarily towards the front door, betraying an underlying sense of anticipation, as if she were subconsciously expecting the arrival of another guest. Her hand lingered near her phone, nestled discreetly within the pocket of her flowing dress, as if drawn to it by an invisible force. The unanswered question hung heavy in the air. Who was she expecting, and what secrets did her anxious glances conceal? For a fleeting moment, the screen of her mobile device illuminated, accompanied by a subtle vibration signaling the arrival of a new message. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, she silenced the notification, locking her phone and forcing her lips into a wider, more convincing smile. Seemingly, no one around her took notice of this furtive action, yet her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped bird. The afternoon unfolded with the customary rituals of a traditional baby shower. Friends proudly displayed adorable onesies and bibs for all to admire, their voices filled with playful enthusiasm. Cousins exchanged light-hearted jokes about the impending sleepless nights that lay ahead, their laughter echoing through the air. Children, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, engaged in a spirited game of tag in the sun-drenched backyard. The tantalizing aroma of barbecue wafted in from a neighbor's grill, mingling with the sweet, sugary scent of frosting that permeated the air. Melissa clapped her hands together with forced gaiety as the cake was presented, a magnificent 3-tiered confection adorned with delicate pastel roses. A collective cheer erupted as she ceremoniously cut the first slice, Yet even amidst the exuberant celebration, something about Melissa's laughter felt strained, as if it were a carefully constructed mask. To those who knew her best, she appeared preoccupied, her eyes darting nervously around the room, her smile arriving a fraction of a second too late, betraying her inner turmoil. She embraced her friends tightly, almost desperately, as if consumed by a premonition that this might be the last time she would have the opportunity to hold them close. The unanswered message on her phone remained a silent sentinel, casting a pall over the otherwise joyous occasion and leaving everyone wondering about the secrets it held. David, maintaining a watchful presence near the kitchen, observed the unfolding events with a discerning eye. He couldn't help but notice the subtle flinch that crossed Melissa's face each time her phone emitted a buzz, a barely perceptible reaction that spoke volumes. He also noted the way she seemed to avoid his gaze whenever he raised his glass in her direction, a deliberate act that sent a shiver of unease down his spine. Despite the gnawing feeling in his gut, he remained outwardly silent, choosing to suppress his mounting suspicions and desperately clinging to the belief that it was merely pre-baby nerves. The Patterson residence throbbed with the vibrant energy of celebration, music cascading from strategically placed speakers, laughter reverberating through the halls. To the casual observer driving past, it appeared to be a quintessential Texas gathering, a picture-perfect scene of domestic bliss, a family blessed, a couple thriving, and the imminent arrival of a cherished new member. No one could possibly imagine that beneath the festive decorations and the forced cheerfulness, the Carters' marriage was already fractured, as fragile and delicate as a pane of glass on the verge of shattering. Little did anyone suspect that by the end of this seemingly joyous day, the colorful balloons would still be suspended from the ceiling, the elaborate cake would remain untouched on the table, and the house would be sealed off with stark yellow tape, transformed into a grim crime scene in the heart of Suburbia. For the moment, the illusion of perfection lingered in the air, a carefully constructed facade that masked the underlying tensions simmering beneath the surface. Melissa's radiant smile, though strained, still managed to convey a semblance of joy, while David's quiet presence exuded an air of calm detachment. The collective hum of voices, rising in celebratory chorus, created a vibrant tapestry of sound that filled the house. It was a snapshot of happiness, frozen in time, fragile and fleeting, teetering on the precipice of collapse. A perfect day, or so it seemed to the unsuspecting eyes of those gathered. If the baby shower represented the polished picture frame, meticulously crafted to showcase an image of domestic bliss, Melissa's clandestine secret was the hairline crack running precariously behind the glass, threatening to shatter the entire composition. To the outside world, she appeared to be the epitome of a glowing, expectant mother, a devoted wife with a stable home, a woman who had finally been blessed with the gift of motherhood after years of longing. However, far removed from the festive atmosphere of balloons and streamers, Melissa had painstakingly constructed a parallel existence, a secret life that she kept hidden, even from herself at times, buried deep within the recesses of her heart. She had encountered Jordan quite by chance, during a late-night delivery run. A particularly heavy box required lifting, and there he was, a 34-year-old warehouse worker with a ruggedly handsome jawline and an infectious energy that Melissa hadn't experienced in what felt like decades. He cracked a playful joke about rescuing damsels in distress, and Melissa found herself laughing with an abandon she hadn't felt in months, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent night. Initially, their interactions were entirely innocuous, characterized by harmless banter and fleeting moments of shared laughter. But what started as a spark of innocent flirtation soon threatened to erupt into a consuming inferno, with consequences that no one could have foreseen. Initially, their interactions consisted of innocent flirtation and a shared smile whenever she happened to stop by the warehouse, but it soon evolved into something more profound, an undeniable spark that she found increasingly difficult to ignore. At home, David remained a steadfast and reliable presence, but also emotionally distant, a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day. He would arrive home each evening, visibly worn out from the rigors of the day, his heavy work boots dragging across the floor, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He would eat dinner in silence, his attention absorbed by the evening news, and often drift off to sleep in his recliner before Melissa had even finished folding the laundry, a routine that had become both familiar and isolating. It wasn't an act of cruelty or intentional neglect, but rather the result of sheer exhaustion, ingrained habit, and a pervasive silence that had gradually enveloped their marriage like tenacious ivy, slowly suffocating the once vibrant connection they had shared over 2 decades. Melissa had made numerous attempts to bridge the growing gap between them, but somewhere along the way, their heartfelt conversations had dwindled into perfunctory exchanges about grocery lists and mortgage payments, devoid of any genuine emotional intimacy. Jordan, with his infectious enthusiasm and unwavering attention, filled that void like a surging flood, inundating her senses and awakening dormant desires. He would text her, "Good morning," messages adorned with silly emojis, compliment her beauty, and reassure her that she deserved far more than simply surviving the monotonous routine of daily life. He made her feel desired, vibrant, and recklessly alive, emotions she hadn't experienced in years. She would secretly meet him after work, her pulse racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, as if she were a rebellious teenager sneaking out for a clandestine rendezvous. They would sit together in his truck, their passionate kisses fogging up the windows, whispering tentative plans that both knew were fraught with danger and potentially devastating consequences. The thrill of their forbidden love affair was intoxicating, but the fear of discovery loomed large, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed facade of her life. One fateful night, parked beneath a desolate stretch of highway, bathed in the inky darkness, Jordan gently traced his fingers along her cheek, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and determination. "You don't have to live like this, Melissa," he declared, his voice low and intense. "You can leave him. You can be with me, truly and completely." Melissa shook her head, her throat constricted with a complex blend of guilt, fear, and desire. "It's not that simple, Jordan," she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my husband, and this baby, it's all we've ever wanted, a dream we've shared for as long as I can remember." Jordan leaned back against the truck seat, a flicker of frustration momentarily crossing his features. "So what am I then? Just your secret thrill, a fleeting escape from the mundane? Some part-time fantasy that you'll discard the moment you decide to go back to your real life?" "No," she whispered, her voice laced with genuine emotion, as she reached out and pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "You mean so much more than that to me, Jordan. You make me feel alive, vibrant, and truly seen for the first time in years. But I can't just blow up everything, destroy the life I've built, and hurt the people I love." Their illicit affair stretched on like a rubber band pulled taut to its breaking point, each clandestine meeting growing increasingly risky, each fabricated excuse wearing thinner and more transparent. Melissa repeatedly told herself that she would end it, that it was merely a temporary phase, a fleeting moment of madness that would fade away once the baby arrived. However, Jordan was not a man content to remain relegated to the shadows, a hidden figure lurking on the periphery of her life. He grew restless and impatient, his initial devotion gradually curdling into something darker and more desperate with each passing day that Melissa hesitated to fully commit to him. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, a ticking time bomb threatening to detonate and shatter the fragile equilibrium of their lives. He desperately needed her to make a definitive choice, to publicly declare her allegiance, and prove that she wasn't merely toying with his emotions or engaging in a reckless game of cat and mouse. At times, his text messages would arrive in the dead of night, their tone sharp and accusatory, fueled by a consuming jealousy that bordered on obsession. "What are you doing lying next to him in bed when you should be here with me, wrapped in my arms?" he would demand, his words laced with a possessiveness that sent shivers down her spine. On other occasions, his messages would be filled with a wounded plea, a desperate cry for reassurance. "Please, Melissa, tell me you love me more than him," he would beg, his vulnerability laid bare. "Tell me you'll leave him, abandon everything, and choose me." Melissa, perpetually torn between the overwhelming guilt that gnawed at her conscience and the intoxicating passion that consumed her, often left those emotionally charged messages unanswered until the cold light of morning, hoping that the distance of time would somehow diffuse their intensity. However, Her prolonged silence only served to fuel Jordan's growing obsession, further inflaming his insecurities and pushing him closer to the edge. Meanwhile, David, though outwardly stoic, was not oblivious to the subtle shifts in Melissa's behavior. He wasn't a fool, and he possessed a keen sense of perception that allowed him to detect the subtle cracks in their carefully constructed facade of marital harmony. He noticed the furtive way she would hide her phone under a pillow, the sudden and unexplained need to step out onto the porch to take phone calls, and the telltale flush that would creep up her cheeks upon her return indoors. He also couldn't ignore the fact that her smile no longer reached her eyes, a subtle but significant change that spoke volumes about her inner turmoil. Despite his growing suspicions, he refrained from directly confronting her, perhaps because a part of him was terrified of the truth that he might uncover, the devastating revelation that could shatter the foundation of their marriage beyond repair. However, the weight of his suspicion pressed down on him, a suffocating burden that permeated every strained silence at the dinner table, casting a pall over their once comfortable routine. To Melissa, it felt as though she were living on borrowed time, constantly walking on eggshells, and she couldn't shake the gnawing fear that one day David would simply look at her, his gaze piercing through her carefully constructed defenses, and know everything, exposing her secret and shattering their world. She repeatedly promised herself that she would find a way out of the tangled web of deceit and desire that had ensnared her, a resolution she clung to with unwavering determination. Just a few more weeks, she would reassure herself, her thoughts racing with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Just until after the baby shower, after the celebrations have subsided and the dust has settled. Then, she vowed, she would summon the courage to confront Jordan, to sever their connection once and for all, and to attempt to salvage what remained of her marriage. However, Jordan, driven by his own agenda and fueled by an unwavering sense of entitlement, had formulated a plan of his own, a course of action that threatened to shatter Melissa's carefully laid plans and plunge her life into utter chaos. One fateful evening, as they sat together in his truck, the windows rolled down to allow the cool night air to circulate, the incessant chirping of cicadas providing a discordant soundtrack to their tense exchange, he turned to her, his gaze resolute and unwavering. "I'm done hiding, Melissa," he declared, his voice devoid of any warmth or tenderness. "If you won't tell him the truth, then I will." Her stomach plummeted, as if she had suddenly been dropped from a great height, a wave of icy dread washing over her. "You can't do that, Jordan," she pleaded, her voice laced with desperation. "Please don't ruin this. Not now, not when everything is so close." Jordan scoffed, his expression hardening with resentment. "Ruin it? I'm saving you, Melissa. I'm saving us from a lifetime of regret and unfulfilled desires. You can't keep stringing me along, dangling me on a string while you play house with him, pretending that everything is perfect. It's not like that," she countered, her voice rising in protest, desperate to salvage the situation. "You know I care about you, Jordan, deeply. But this just can't be the way. There has to be another way." But Jordan's eyes were hard and unyielding, his jaw set with unwavering determination. He had already made up his mind, and no amount of pleading or reasoning could dissuade him from his chosen course of action. Back at home, Melissa lay awake next to David, her body tense and her mind racing, her gaze fixed on the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, monotonous circles above her. Her husband's steady, rhythmic breathing should have soothed her frayed nerves, providing a sense of comfort and security, but instead, it only served to amplify her feelings of guilt and entrapment, making her feel as though she were suffocating under the weight of her own deceit. The question that haunted her was, would Jordan follow through with his threat, and if so, what would be the devastating consequences? She gently pressed a hand against her burgeoning belly, her touch conveying a mixture of protectiveness and desperation, and whispered a silent promise to the unborn child nestled within. "I'll fix this, my darling. I promise Mommy will find a way to fix this, to make everything right again, no matter what it takes." But her whispered reassurance, though heartfelt, was not enough to calm the tempest raging inside her, the swirling vortex of guilt, fear, and uncertainty that threatened to consume her entirely. After David had drifted deeper into the realm of sleep, his breathing becoming slow and regular, Melissa slipped quietly out of bed, her movements as stealthy as possible, and made her way into the dimly lit kitchen. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator, and long, distorted shadows stretched across the cool tiled floor, creating an atmosphere of foreboding. She sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly, and poured herself a cup of cold water, the icy liquid doing little to quench the burning anxiety that gripped her. Her gaze was transfixed by the soft glow emanating from her phone, the screen displaying a string of unread messages from Jordan, their contents ranging from desperate pleas and veiled threats to fervent declarations of undying love, each one a painful reminder of the precarious situation she found herself in. She opened her journal, the one she kept hidden in the back of a drawer, a repository of her innermost thoughts and secrets, and began to write with a trembling hand, her words pouring out in a torrent of emotion. "I never meant for this to go so far, to spiral so completely out of control," she confessed, her pen gliding across the page. "I thought he was just a spark in the darkness, a fleeting reminder that I'm still alive, that I'm still capable of feeling something. But now the fire has grown too intense, the flames licking at the edges of my carefully constructed life, threatening to engulf everything in their path. If David ever finds out, if Jordan ever forces me to choose between them." She trailed off, her pen pressing so hard against the paper that the ink bled through, creating a dark, inky stain that mirrored the stain on her soul. Melissa closed the book with a snap, pressing her forehead against its smooth cover, the weight of her secrets crushing her, and silent tears slid down her cheeks, tracing a glistening path through the darkness. As she sat there alone in the silent kitchen, the weight of her choices pressing down on her, she couldn't help but wonder if the carefully constructed facade of her life was about to crumble, leaving her, and everyone she loved in its wake. She whispered a desperate plea into the empty room, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "God, please, I'm begging you, just give me one more chance to make this right, to undo the damage I've caused, to salvage what's left of my life. Don't let tomorrow destroy us, tear us apart, and leave us shattered beyond repair." When she finally returned to bed, her pillow was damp with the remnants of her silent tears, a testament to the emotional turmoil she had endured, and the smile she would paint on her face the next morning would be a carefully constructed mask, designed to conceal the deep cracks that threatened to shatter her facade of normalcy. Yet, deep inside, beneath the carefully constructed layers of denial and self-deception, she knew that promises were often just empty words, easily broken and forgotten, and that the precarious situation she found herself in was rapidly spiraling out of her control. Jordan's anger, once a flickering flame, had now sharpened into something dangerous and unpredictable, a volatile force that threatened to ignite and consume everything in its path. And secrets, once they slipped through the cracks of carefully constructed walls, had a way of festering and growing, tearing apart the very fabric of relationships and leaving behind a trail of devastation. While Melissa wrestled with her clandestine affair, battling the conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, David Patterson moved like a ghost through his own home, a silent observer haunted by unspoken suspicions and growing anxieties. To the outside world, he appeared to be the epitome of stability and dependability, the kind of man who showed up to work every day without fail, paid his bills on time, meticulously mowed his lawn on Saturdays, and offered a polite nod to his neighbors over the fence, a pillar of the community who never made waves or drew attention to himself. He was the very definition of ordinary, a man who blended seamlessly into the background. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something heavy pressed against his chest every night, a suffocating weight he couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore, a nagging sense of unease that gnawed at him incessantly, eroding his peace of mind. At 49 years old, David bore the quiet scars of a soldier's past, both visible and invisible, Benjamins that had shaped him into the man he was today, a man of unwavering resolve, but also one haunted by the ghosts of his experiences. Years earlier, in his youth, he had served his country in the military, a period of his life that had left an indelible Benjamin on his character, shaping him in ways that were both profound and subtle. Although he rarely spoke of his experiences during those years, the discipline and unwavering sense of duty he had acquired never truly left him, permeating every aspect of his life. He woke religiously before dawn each morning, fueled himself with a cup of strong black coffee, and carried himself with a rigid posture that commanded respect, inadvertently causing strangers to think twice before daring to challenge him or cross his path. But behind the unwavering firmness of his demeanor, there was a weariness, a palpable sense of fatigue that belied his outward strength. He was a man who had witnessed enough of the world's harsh realities to crave the simple solace of peace and tranquility, only to discover that even the sanctuary of home could become a battlefield, fraught with unspoken tensions and simmering conflicts. When Melissa first shared the news that she was pregnant, his heart had nearly burst with a mixture of joy, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. After decades of persistent trying, enduring countless frustrating doctor visits, and suffering through numerous heart-wrenching disappointments, this unexpected pregnancy felt like an act of divine redemption, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He had wept openly and unashamedly in the solitude of his truck the day she told him, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, whispering fervent thanks under his breath, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the blessing. He had made a solemn promise to himself in that moment, a vow that he would do everything within his power, everything humanly possible, to protect her and to safeguard their precious child from any harm that might come their way. But lately, a growing sense of unease had settled upon him, a disquieting feeling that Melissa had become increasingly distant, both physically and emotionally, as if her body was present in the house, but her spirit lingered elsewhere, tethered to something he couldn't quite grasp. The chasm between them seemed to widen with each passing day, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty and unspoken anxieties. She would plaster on a bright and cheerful smile whenever friends came to visit, engaging in lively conversation and radiating an outward appearance of happiness. But the moment the front doors shut behind their departing guests, her carefully constructed facade would crumble, and her energy seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving her listless and withdrawn. At dinner, her fork barely moved, as she picked at her food with a lack of appetite, her gaze distant and preoccupied. At night, she would curl away from him in bed, creating a physical and emotional barrier that left him feeling isolated and alone in his own marriage. And then there was the ever-present phone, always buzzing with surreptitious notifications, always tucked away out of sight, and always slipping into her hand when she mistakenly believed he wasn't watching, a constant reminder of the secrets that she harbored. David wasn't blind or naive. He had learned to read the subtle nuances of human behavior, to decipher the hidden meanings behind unspoken words, and to interpret the pregnant silences that often spoke volumes. He noticed the way Melissa would jump slightly whenever he walked unexpectedly into the room, the way her laughter would erupt too quickly and at inappropriate moments, and the way her eyes would dart away from his, unable to hold his gaze, whenever he asked simple, innocuous questions like, "Who was that on the phone?" "Just a friend," she would reply, her voice sounding too light and airy, her tone carefully calibrated to deflect suspicion. Her smile would be too practiced, too perfect, lacking the genuine warmth that had once characterized their interactions. David didn't argue or press the issue. He simply nodded in feigned understanding, swallowed the rising tide of unease that threatened to overwhelm him, and retreated to the solitude of the garage, where he would spend hours meticulously polishing the same wrench, his mind consumed by a maelstrom of doubts and anxieties. Was his wife hiding something from him, concealing a secret that could shatter their world? Was she hiding someone, a clandestine lover who had captured her heart and stolen her away from him? At work, he found himself staring blankly at blueprints, his vision blurred by his troubled thoughts, unable to focus on the task at hand, his mind replaying the same haunting questions over and over again, leaving him feeling lost and adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, and the only question that remained was whether the truth would emerge before it was too late to salvage what remained of their marriage. His coworkers couldn't help but notice that he had become increasingly withdrawn and taciturn, a stark contrast to his usual affable and easygoing demeanor. They also observed that his temper had grown shorter, and he was prone to snapping at them over small mistakes, a sign that something was clearly amiss. In the evenings, after a long and arduous day at work, he would retreat to the back porch, seeking solace in the solitude of the night. He would sit there for hours, a can of beer sweating in his hand, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the yard, while the incessant chirping of cicadas filled the air, their shrill calls a constant reminder of the turmoil that raged within him. He tried desperately to convince himself that he was simply imagining things, that Melissa was merely experiencing heightened anxiety due to the pregnancy, and that hormones could make anyone act strangely, leading them to behave in ways that were out of character. But the knot in his gut tightened with each passing day, refusing to be ignored, and the nagging suspicion that something was terribly wrong continued to gnaw at him relentlessly. One fateful Saturday afternoon, David came home unexpectedly early from a job site, his arrival catching Melissa completely off guard. As he approached the house, he glanced through the window and saw her sitting on the couch, her phone pressed tightly to her ear, her posture tense and her expression strained. Her voice was hushed but urgent, betraying a sense of desperation. He caught only fragmented snippets of the conversation, fleeting phrases that piqued his curiosity and fueled his growing suspicions. Words like, "I can't right now," and, "But you promise," drifted through the air, painting a picture of a clandestine exchange that she clearly didn't want him to overhear. When she finally noticed him standing in the doorway, his presence shattering the illusion of privacy, she fumbled to hang up the phone, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Her cheeks flushed with a telltale blush, a clear indication that she had been caught in the act of deception. "Who was that?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled, but his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "My sister," she answered quickly, too quickly, her response lacking the naturalness and authenticity that would have put his mind at ease. He didn't press the issue further, choosing to suppress his doubts for the moment, but something inside him hardened, a resolve solidifying in his heart. He remembered the combat training he had undergone years earlier, the lessons imparted by his instructors about the importance of trusting one's instincts, about heeding the subtle warning signs that could mean the difference between life and death. "Trust your gut," they had drilled into him, and now, his gut was screaming that something was terribly wrong. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and David knew that he couldn't ignore them any longer. He would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and he would protect his family at all costs. "It will save your life." His gut was screaming now, sending a clear and unmistakable message that he couldn't afford to ignore. Still, despite the gnawing suspicions that threatened to consume him, he loved her, his heart aching with a mixture of longing and confusion. God help him, he loved her more than he hated the insidious feeling that she was betraying him, that the woman he had built a life with for over 2 decades was keeping secrets from him. So, he made a conscious decision to bury his doubts, to suppress the rising tide of anxiety, hoping against hope that it would fade away with time, that Melissa would eventually come back to him on her own, drawn back by the strength of their shared history and the bonds of their enduring love. But in the quiet hours of the night, when she turned her back to him in bed, creating a physical and emotional divide that he couldn't bridge, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with unanswered questions and troubling possibilities. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent, refusing to be silenced or ignored. David desperately wanted to believe in the sanctity of his marriage, to cling to the hope that the vows they had exchanged so many years ago still held meaning, that the love they had once shared could withstand the challenges they faced. He wanted to believe that 20 years together, the countless nights of holding each other through grief and loss, the shared laughter and cherished memories, all of it meant more than a few unexplained phone calls and fleeting moments of suspicion. But a man can only lie to himself for so long, and David knew that he was reaching the limits of his self-deception. The baby shower was rapidly approaching, and David clung to the hope that it would represent a fresh start, a chance to rekindle the spark that had once burned so brightly between them. Surrounded by their closest friends and family, with gifts piled high as a symbol of their shared joy, and with laughter filling the rooms, he dared to believe that maybe Melissa's glow would be genuine again, reflecting a true and unwavering happiness. Maybe the distance that had grown between them would miraculously close, and he would finally have his wife back, the woman he had fallen in love with so many years ago, the woman he had promised to cherish and protect for the rest of his days. However, deep down, a nagging sense of unease persisted, a premonition that the carefully constructed facade of their marriage was about to crumble, threatening to bury them both beneath its weight. He couldn't possibly have known then that the joyous celebration he so desperately hoped would heal the wounds that had festered within their marriage would instead serve as the catalyst that would rip their lives apart, shattering their carefully constructed world and leaving them both irrevocably scarred. Jordan Hayes had never been a patient man, possessing a restless spirit and an impulsive nature that often led him down paths fraught with peril. At 34 years old, his life was a haphazard string of quick decisions, impulsive choices made on a whim without regard for the consequences. Some of those decisions had been thrilling and exhilarating, providing fleeting moments of excitement and adventure, while others had been undeniably reckless, driven by a lack of foresight and a disregard for the potential repercussions. More often than not, his impulsive actions left behind a trail of wreckage and regret, causing more harm than good and leaving him with a sense of emptiness and disillusionment. But when he met Melissa, something shifted within him, and he dared to believe, for the first time in his life, that maybe he had stumbled into something real and meaningful, a connection that transcended the superficiality of his past relationships. She wasn't like the other women who had drifted in and out of his life, fleeting figures who had left little more than a lingering scent of perfume and a collection of fading memories. She was older, possessing a maturity and wisdom that he found both alluring and comforting. She was elegant and sophisticated, carrying herself with a grace and poise that captivated him, and the mere fact that she desired him, that she found him worthy of her attention, made him feel powerful and significant. At first, the clandestine nature of their affair had been undeniably exciting, adding a thrill of danger and forbidden pleasure to their encounters. The stolen moments of intimacy, the whispered text messages exchanged at midnight, the quick, furtive kisses stolen in the confines of his truck, and the clandestine rendezvous in anonymous hotel rooms paid for in cash, all contributed to the intoxicating allure of their secret world. But as the months passed, the initial thrill began to erode, replaced by a gnawing sense of frustration and resentment. Every time Melissa whispered that she couldn't leave her husband, that she was bound by duty and obligation, and every time she begged him to just wait a little longer, clinging to the hope that a solution would somehow magically present itself, Jordan felt his pride and self-worth diminish, his sense of value slowly eroding. He wasn't a dirty little secret, a shameful dalliance to be hidden away in the shadows. He wasn't meant to be relegated to the shadows, a hidden figure lurking on the periphery of her life while she played house with a man who, in Jordan's eyes, didn't deserve her, a man who seemed oblivious to her true worth and incapable of providing her with the happiness she deserved. One night, parked on the desolate edge of town, the oppressive heat pressing through the windshield of his truck, and the incessant buzzing of cicadas filling the air with their discordant symphony, Jordan slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his frustration boiling over. "How long are you going to keep living this lie, Melissa?" he demanded, his voice laced with anger and desperation. "You said you loved me, that I was the only one who truly understood you. Prove it. Show me that your words aren't just empty promises." Melissa's voice cracked, weary with guilt and the weight of her own deception. "I do love you, Jordan, you know I do," she pleaded, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "But I can't destroy him like this, shatter his world and leave him with nothing. He's been my husband for 20 years, my partner, my friend. And this baby, it's everything he's ever wanted." He cut her off, his tone sharp and accusatory. "What about me, Melissa? What about my feelings, my desires, my needs? Am I just a mistake you keep tucked away in the shadows, a dirty little secret you're ashamed to acknowledge? Do you even begin to understand how it feels to give you everything, to pour my heart and soul into this relationship, and get nothing back in return?" Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over as she struggled to contain her emotions. "Please, Jordan, don't make this harder than it already is," she begged, her voice trembling. "Just give me time, a little more time, and I promise I'll find a way to make things right, to navigate this impossible situation." But Jordan had already made up his mind, his resolve hardening with each passing day. Time had run out, and he was no longer willing to wait patiently in the wings while Melissa struggled to reconcile her conflicting desires. As the baby shower drew closer, his anger sharpened into a dangerous obsession, consuming his thoughts and fueling his determination to expose the truth, no matter the cost. He told himself that he wasn't just seeking revenge, that his motives were not driven solely by spite and resentment. He convinced himself that Melissa needed to be freed from her own cowardice, that she was trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, too afraid to break free and embrace the life she truly deserved. If she won't choose me, if she lacks the courage to make the difficult decision, he reasoned, I'll make sure she doesn't get to choose him either. I'll force her hand, expose the truth, and let the chips fall where they may. He scrolled through his phone, his fingers tracing the surface of the screen as he reread the damning evidence he had painstakingly collected over the course of their affair, each piece of information a weapon in his arsenal. He reviewed the stolen photos of their passionate kisses, the clandestine images captured in moments of unguarded intimacy, the screenshots of their late-night conversations, filled with heartfelt confessions of love and promises of a future together. Each file felt like a weapon, sharp and deadly, and he polished them in his mind, honing them to perfection the way a soldier meticulously sharpens a blade, preparing for battle. The night before the baby shower, Jordan sat alone in his sparsely furnished apartment, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of traffic from the street below. A bottle of whiskey sat half-empty on the table before him, its amber liquid reflecting the dim light of the room, and the glow of his phone illuminated his hardened face, casting harsh shadows that accentuated his determined features. He mentally rehearsed what he would say, crafting the perfect speech to deliver his explosive revelation, picturing the shock and disbelief on David's face, the hushed whispers from the assembled guests, and the devastating way Melissa's world would shatter into a million pieces. He wanted her to regret every lie she had ever told, every promise she had broken, and every moment she had chosen to prioritize her own comfort over his feelings. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind, a fleeting hesitation that threatened to derail his carefully laid plans. Was he going too far? Was he about to unleash a level of destruction that could never be undone? Would she ever be able to forgive him for the pain he was about to inflict? But then, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long surged to the forefront, drowning out the last vestiges of doubt and hesitation. He muttered the words into the empty room, his voice filled with a mixture of resentment and self-justification. She forced me to do this, she left me with no other choice. She should have been honest from the start, but she chose to deceive us all. Now she'll have to face the consequences of her actions. She made me her secret, a shameful dalliance to be hidden away in the shadows, and I refuse to allow her to continue treating me with such blatant disrespect. Not anymore. Today, everything changes. On the morning of the baby shower, Jordan dressed carefully, meticulously selecting his attire with a level of attention to detail that was uncharacteristic of him. He chose a pair of clean, well-fitting jeans and a freshly pressed shirt, striving to present an image of composed respectability. He looked intently in the mirror, scrutinizing his reflection, his jaw set with unwavering resolve, and his eyes dark with a burning determination. This was no longer about love, about the tender emotions that had once drawn him to Melissa. It was now about pride, about reclaiming the dignity he felt Melissa had stolen from him, about asserting his own sense of worth in the face of her perceived betrayal. As he drove toward the Patterson home, the festive balloons bobbing in the distance like colorful beacons, his grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white with tension. He envisioned Melissa's face when he walked through the door, the look of shock and disbelief that would undoubtedly register on her features, imagined her begging him to stop, pleading with him to reconsider his course of action. But this time, unlike all the times before, she wouldn't control the narrative, she wouldn't be able to manipulate the situation to suit her own needs. For once, the truth would belong to him, and he would wield it as a weapon, exposing her deceit and forcing her to face the consequences of her choices. And with that thought, a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins, Jordan pressed his foot firmly on the gas pedal and headed straight for the seemingly joyous celebration that was about to transform into a living nightmare, a scene of devastation that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. The Patterson house was alive with the vibrant energy of celebration, the air thick with anticipation and excitement. Laughter rolled from room to room, echoing through the halls like a joyful symphony, and children darted between the legs of the assembled guests, their fingers coated with sweet frosting, leaving a trail of sugary delight in their wake. The air carried a tantalizing blend of aromas, the sweet and sugary scent of the elaborately decorated cake mingling with the savory tang of barbecue drifting in from the yard, creating a sensory tapestry that evoked a sense of warmth and familial connection. For Melissa, this day was supposed to be her day, a moment of pure and unadulterated joy, a celebration of the long-awaited miracle growing inside her womb, a testament to the resilience of hope and the power of dreams. She clutched her glass of sparkling punch, the sweet, bubbly liquid doing little to calm her frayed nerves, and desperately tried to let the genuine cheer and heartfelt goodwill of her loved ones wash over her, hoping to banish the darkness that threatened to engulf her. But despite her best efforts, her stomach tightened with each passing second, a knot of anxiety forming in the pit of her abdomen that refused to dissipate. She hadn't seen Jordan arrive, and she prayed with every fiber of her being that maybe, just maybe, he had had a change of heart, that he had decided to stay away, sparing her the public humiliation and devastating consequences that she knew were inevitable if he were to reveal their secret. She forced herself to smile at her neighbors, offering a warm and welcoming greeting, accepted hugs from her cousins, plastering on an expression of gratitude and affection, and even managed to laugh at the silly baby games her friends had so thoughtfully planned, participating in the festivities with a feigned enthusiasm that belied her inner turmoil. But every time the front door creaked open, her heart lurched violently in her chest, her breath catching in her throat as she braced herself for the inevitable confrontation. Then, the moment she had dreaded finally arrived. The door creaked open once again, and there he was, standing framed in the afternoon light, his tall, imposing figure cutting through the lively chatter like a dark shadow falling across the room, extinguishing the warmth and joy that had permeated the atmosphere. His jaw was set with unwavering determination, his eyes were cold and devoid of any warmth, and in his hand, his phone glowed ominously, like a weapon poised to strike, ready to unleash its devastating payload of secrets and lies. Conversation faltered and died as the assembled guests turned to see the uninvited man stride purposefully inside, his presence disrupting the carefully orchestrated harmony of the celebration. Melissa froze, her carefully constructed smile slipping from her face, revealing the fear and desperation that she had tried so hard to conceal. No, she thought, her mind racing, her thoughts a jumbled mess of panic and denial. Not here, not now, not in front of everyone I care about. Jordan's voice boomed over the suddenly silent crowd, his words cutting through the air like a knife, shattering the illusion of happiness, and setting the stage for a catastrophic unraveling. You all think this is a happy family, huh? That this is some kind of fairy tale, a picture-perfect scene of domestic bliss? He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm and resentment. Well, let me show you the truth, the ugly reality that lies beneath the surface of this carefully constructed facade. His words sliced through the air, sharp and deliberate, each syllable carefully enunciated to maximize the impact of his devastating revelation. He held up his phone, displaying the incriminating evidence for all to see, the screen flashing with a series of scandalous photos of him and Melissa, captured in moments of intimate embrace, their secret affair laid bare for the world to judge. There they were, their bodies entwined, her head pressed against his chest in a gesture of tender affection, their lips locked in the kind of passionate kiss that left no room for doubt, a clear and undeniable confirmation of their illicit relationship. Gasps of shock and disbelief rippled through the room as the assembled guests struggled to process the scene unfolding before their eyes, the carefully constructed illusion of happiness shattered in an instant. A woman standing in the back of the room covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief, whispering, "Dear Lord! I can't believe what I'm seeing." A cousin, her face pale with shock, dropped the gift bag she had been holding, the contents spilling onto the floor in a cascade of brightly colored wrapping paper and tiny baby clothes, the innocent garments now lying scattered on the floor like a silent accusation. One of Melissa's elderly neighbors, her face etched with disapproval, shook her head slowly, muttering under her breath, "I knew something wasn't right. I felt it in my bones. I just knew it, there was something off about her. Children, sensing the sudden and dramatic shift in the atmosphere, clutched tightly to their mother's legs, their faces etched with confusion and fear, frightened by the tension that had permeated the room. A little boy tugged anxiously on his father's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why is everyone yelling, Daddy? What's happening?" The father, his own face a mask of shock and disbelief, had no answer to offer his son, unable to comprehend the scene that was unfolding before him. Someone standing near the doorway, his voice trembling with anger and indignation, shouted, "Stop this madness, Jordan! Have you no decency? Get out of here and take your filth with you! Not here, Jordan! Not in front of everyone, not at her baby's shower! Have you no shame?" But Jordan's face twisted with a mixture of pride and bitterness, his features contorted by a potent blend of self-righteousness and vengeful satisfaction. His voice only rose louder, feeding on the gasps and stares that filled the room, reveling in the attention he had so desperately craved. The festive decorations that had once symbolized joy and celebration, the brightly colored balloons bobbing cheerfully in the air, the cascading streamers adorning the walls, the delicate pastel plates stacked neatly on the table, suddenly looked grotesque and out of place, starkly contrasting with the palpable atmosphere of shame, betrayal, and shattered illusions. The laughter that had filled the house only minutes before, echoing through the rooms like a joyful symphony, was now gone, replaced by the heavy thrum of judgment, disbelief, and fear, a suffocating silence that hung in the air like a shroud. Melissa's face, drained of all color, appeared ashen and lifeless, her features contorted with a mixture of horror and desperation. She stumbled forward, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, Jordan, don't do this," she pleaded, her eyes filled with tears, desperate to salvage what was left of her reputation and protect her loved ones from further pain. But Jordan only sneered, his expression one of cold indifference as he continued to scroll through the incriminating messages, displaying her words of affection and her heartfelt promises for all to see, each sentence a damning indictment of her deceit. He thrust the phone toward the assembled guests as if to pass judgment, demanding that they bear witness to her infidelity and betrayal, forcing them to confront the reality that the woman they had thought they knew was capable of such profound deception. "She's been lying to you all, to him, to everyone she claims to care about," he declared, his voice ringing with self-righteous indignation. "I'm the one she really loves, the one she truly desires. He's just a convenient placeholder, a means to an end." The sudden sound of balloons popping somewhere in the corners of the room startled the children, their innocent ears unaccustomed to such harsh and jarring noises. One of the children, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in atmosphere, began to cry, his small body trembling with fear, and a mother, her face etched with concern, hurried him outside, seeking to shield him from the unfolding drama. The cheerful decorations, once symbols of joy and celebration, now looked garish and mocking, their bright colors a cruel reminder of the happiness that had been so abruptly shattered. David stood frozen in place at the edge of the living room, his body rigid with shock and disbelief, his mind struggling to process the scene that was unfolding before his eyes. His glass of punch, clutched tightly in his hand, slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor with a loud, resounding crash, the sweet liquid spreading across the tiles like a crimson stain, a symbolic representation of the blood that had been spilled on this day of supposed celebration. For a long, suffocating moment, he remained completely silent, his face a mask of stoic composure, unreadable and inscrutable. But his eyes, those windows to his soul, were locked onto Melissa's trembling form, conveying a depth of pain and betrayal that words could never adequately express. "David!" Melissa's voice cracked, barely more than a whisper, as she desperately tried to reach him, to somehow explain away the damning evidence that had been laid bare before them all. "It's not what you think, please, you have to believe me." But the evidence glowed brightly from Jordan's phone, undeniable and unrelenting, a constant reminder of the deceit and infidelity that had been perpetrated behind his back. The guests, their initial shock giving way to morbid curiosity, whispered louder now, their voices a hushed chorus of judgment and speculation. Some covered their mouths with their hands, unable to utter a word, while others stared at David with wide, horrified eyes, their faces reflecting a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. Jordan, sensing the opportunity to inflict further pain, stepped closer, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "Tell him, Melissa," he demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Tell him how many nights you were with me instead of him, sharing intimate moments and whispering sweet nothings. Tell him the truth for once in your life." Melissa shook her head violently, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation, tears streaming down her face, leaving glistening tracks on her pale cheeks. "Stop it, Jordan," she pleaded, her voice barely audible above the din of the room. "You don't know what you're doing, you're destroying everything." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Jordan shot back, his words dripping with bitterness and resentment. "You made me your secret, Melissa, a hidden part of your life that you were ashamed to acknowledge. Not anymore. Today, the truth will be revealed, and everyone will know exactly who you are." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their initial fascination giving way to a sense of unease and apprehension. Some of the guests, sensing the potential for violence, began to edge discreetly toward the door, seeking to escape the volatile situation before it escalated further. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere charged with a sense of impending doom. The once joyous celebration, a scene of laughter and merriment, was now suffocating with tension, the air thick with unspoken accusations and simmering emotions. The festive atmosphere had been replaced by a palpable sense of dread, as if a dark cloud had descended upon the house, casting a long shadow over everyone present. David finally moved, breaking the spell of stunned silence that had gripped him for so long. His shoulders, once slumped with quiet patience and weary resignation, straightened with a newfound resolve, his posture transforming from that of a defeated man to one of steely determination. His voice, low and steady, yet filled with an undercurrent of barely suppressed rage, cut through the chaos, demanding answers and shattering the fragile remnants of the carefully constructed facade. "Is it true, Melissa?" he asked, his gaze unwavering, his eyes boring into her soul, seeking the truth that she had so desperately tried to conceal. "Is everything he's saying true?" Melissa collapsed into a heap of uncontrollable sobs, her body racked with grief and shame. She couldn't bring herself to answer, unable to utter the words that would confirm her infidelity and shatter the life they had built together. And in that deafening silence, David found all the confirmation he needed, the unspoken truth resonating more powerfully than any spoken confession. His face flushed crimson with anger and humiliation, veins bulging in his neck as years of carefully cultivated restraint cracked under the immense weight of betrayal. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his neighbors, the people who had always respected him and looked up to him as a pillar of the community, and at the relatives who had admired his marriage and envied his seemingly perfect life. But now, he saw only pity and judgment reflected in their eyes, the unspoken condemnation cutting him to the core. His pride, his family, his future, all torn apart in a matter of seconds, shattered beyond repair by the woman he had loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world. Melissa reached for him, her hands outstretched, desperate to make amends, to somehow undo the damage she had caused. "David, please," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "I still love you, I swear it's true. I never meant for any of this to happen." But David pulled away, recoiling from her touch as if she were a venomous serpent, his chest heaving with a mixture of grief and fury. He turned abruptly, walking stiffly toward the front door without uttering another word, his silence more deafening than any shouted accusation. The assembled guests parted in silence, their eyes tracking his every move as he disappeared into the sunlight, vanishing from their lives and leaving behind a scene of devastation that would forever be etched in their memories. Melissa crumpled onto the couch, her body collapsing under the weight of her guilt and shame, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably as she covered her face with her hands, desperately trying to shield herself from the judgment of the world. Jordan's anger, which had fueled his actions for so long, began to falter as the full weight of what he had done finally sank in, the realization dawning on him that he had unleashed a chain of events that could have irreversible consequences. The room buzzed with hushed whispers, the assembled guests huddled together in small groups, their voices barely audible above the pounding of their hearts. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation, tugged anxiously on their mother's skirts, their faces etched with confusion and fear, unsure of why the air had suddenly turned so heavy and oppressive. Minutes stretched on like hours, each second an eternity, as everyone waited with bated breath, suspended in a state of terrified anticipation. Then, from outside, the slam of a car trunk echoed through the air, its harsh metallic clang shattering the tense silence, and sending a jolt of fear through everyone present. Heavy footsteps returned, deliberate and chilling, their rhythmic cadence growing louder with each passing moment, signaling the imminent arrival of something terrible. David stepped back into the living room, his face a mask of cold, implacable fury, and in his hand gleamed the cold, unforgiving steel of a pistol, its presence instantly transforming the scene from one of marital discord to one of imminent danger. Gasps of horror filled the air, some guests screaming in terror, their voices piercing the silence like a siren's wail, while others instinctively ducked behind furniture, seeking to protect themselves from the potential carnage. Melissa's head snapped up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. She stumbled to her feet, her arms outstretched in a gesture of supplication, her voice barely audible above the din of the room. "David, no!" she pleaded, her words laced with terror. "Please don't do this, don't throw your life away." But his eyes were no longer those of a weary husband, a man worn down by the trials and tribulations of life. They were the eyes of a man whose pride had been ripped from him in front of the entire world, whose trust had been shattered beyond repair, who had been pushed past the point of no return, driven to the brink of madness by the woman he had loved and the betrayal he had suffered. The baby shower, once a scene filled with laughter, music, and the joyous anticipation of new life, was now a stage set for tragedy, a tableau of despair that would forever be etched in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it. What would happen next, no one could predict, but one thing was certain: the lives of everyone in that room were about to change forever. The sight of the pistol, gleaming menacingly in David's trembling hand, froze the room into a state of absolute silence, as if time itself had come to a standstill. The festive decorations, once symbols of joy and celebration, now seemed grotesquely out of place, mocking the tragedy that was about to unfold. The balloons bobbed lazily in the corners, their colorful surfaces reflecting the harsh light, and the pastel ribbons fluttered gently in the draft of the air conditioner, their delicate movements a stark contrast to the impending violence. And yet, every ounce of festivity had been drained away, leaving only a palpable sense of dread hanging heavy in the air, suffocating everyone present and filling their hearts with a chilling premonition of what was to come. Guests clutched each other tightly, seeking comfort and reassurance in the face of the unfolding horror. Mothers instinctively shielded their children behind their skirts, their protective instincts kicking in, desperately trying to shield their innocent offspring from the violence that was about to erupt. A few of the men, driven by a sense of duty and a primal urge to protect the women and children in their midst, edged forward instinctively, their bodies tensing in preparation for action. But they quickly stopped in their tracks, their courage faltering when they saw the look in David Carter's eyes, a chilling combination of grief, rage, and despair that transcended mere anger. It wasn't just anger, they realized, but a profound devastation that had been sharpened into something lethal, a force of nature that was beyond their ability to control. Melissa stood rooted to the carpet, her swollen belly rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her hands trembled in front of her, palms out as though she could physically stop the storm barreling toward her, as if she could somehow reason with the man she had betrayed and prevent him from committing an unspeakable act. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion, barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "Please put the gun down, I'm begging you. We can fix this, I know we can. We can still fix this, if you'll just give us a chance." But David's expression didn't shift, his face remaining a mask of cold, implacable fury. He stared at her as though she were a stranger, his eyes devoid of any warmth or recognition, his gaze conveying a chilling sense of detachment. His jaw twitched uncontrollably, his finger brushing lightly against the trigger of the pistol, and his chest heaved with ragged breaths, a physical manifestation of the inner turmoil that threatened to consume him entirely. The room held its breath, suspended in a state of terrified anticipation, as everyone waited to see what David Patterson would do next, their hearts pounding in their chests with the horrifying realization that they were about to witness a tragedy unfold before their very eyes. "Fix this?" David repeated, his voice low and guttural, each word rasped from the depths of a shattered soul, a tormented expression of the pain and anguish that had consumed him. "You think you can just fix this, after everything you've done? After the way you've dragged me through hell in front of everyone I know, exposing my humiliation for all the world to see? You lied to me, to them, to everyone we hold dear. You carried another man into my house, into my life, and desecrated everything we built together." His hand shook violently, not from weakness or fear, but more from the immense pressure of everything exploding inside him, the pent-up emotions finally reaching their breaking point and threatening to shatter his sanity. Jordan, realizing the gravity of the situation and the danger he had placed himself in, tried to step forward, his face pale now with fear and regret. "David, please listen to me," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I never intended for any of this to go so far." "Shut your mouth!" David roared, his voice filled with a rage that sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the room, swinging the gun menacingly in Jordan's direction. Jordan froze instantly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his eyes wide with terror. The room gasped as one, the collective intake of breath a testament to the shared sense of horror and anticipation. "You think you can just walk into my home, into my wife's bed, and humiliate me in front of my family and friends? You think there aren't consequences for your actions, that you can simply walk away unscathed?" Melissa's sobs filled the silence, high and desperate, her body racked with grief and remorse. She stepped closer to David, ignoring the gun's deadly sway, her eyes pleading with him to reconsider his course of action. "It was a mistake, David, a moment of weakness that I'll regret for the rest of my life," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "I swear to you, it was just a fleeting moment of weakness, not true love. Please don't do this, don't throw your life away. Don't take away the father of our child, don't take away everything we've ever dreamed of." The word child pierced something deep inside him, a flicker of humanity momentarily breaking through the hardened shell of his anger and despair. The weight of his actions, and the potential consequences for the innocent life growing within Melissa, began to weigh heavily on his conscience. His gaze flickered involuntarily to her stomach, the gentle roundness that held the one thing he had prayed for all his life, the miracle he had longed for and believed he would never receive. For the briefest of moments, his face softened, a flicker of the man he had once been, the man Melissa had fallen in love with, the man who was gentle, hopeful, and filled with an unwavering sense of pride. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the fleeting glimpse of tenderness vanished, replaced by a renewed wave of anger and resentment as his eyes darted back to Jordan, still standing there, the embodiment of every humiliation, every betrayal, every shattered dream. The room seemed to pulse around him, the whispers of the guests growing louder, more insistent, and the accusing eyes of his neighbors digging into his back like knives, each glance a painful reminder of the public spectacle he had become. He felt cornered, trapped by his own emotions and the weight of everyone's judgment, stripped bare of his dignity, his pride bleeding out in front of them all, a humiliating display of his shattered life. His voice shook with a mixture of rage and grief, but the words he spoke cut through the air like steel, sharp and unforgiving. "That's not my child," he declared, his voice devoid of any warmth or affection. "Not anymore. You forfeited that right when you betrayed me, when you chose to carry another man's seed into our marriage, into our lives." Melissa collapsed to her knees, her scream tearing through the house, a primal expression of the pain and despair that threatened to consume her entirely. "No, don't say that, David! Please, I'm begging you, don't say that!" she sobbed, her words laced with desperation. "This baby is yours, I swear it's true. It's ours, a product of our love, our shared dreams. Don't let this be how our child comes into the world, surrounded by violence and hatred. Please, give us a chance to make things right. The heartfelt plea cracked something fragile inside him, momentarily piercing the hardened shell of his anger and resentment. But the surge of rage that coursed through his veins quickly sealed it shut, preventing any flicker of compassion from taking hold. He raised the gun again, his arms steadier this time, his resolve hardening with each passing second. This time, his purpose was clear, his intention unwavering. Jordan, realizing that he was the target, stepped back in terror, his face etched with horror. Man, listen to me, Jordan pleaded, his voice trembling with fear. This isn't worth it, I swear. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I never intended to cause so much pain. But David wasn't listening anymore, his mind consumed by a maelstrom of emotions, his focus narrowed to the trembling figure of his wife. The woman who had been his everything, his confidant, his partner, the woman who had now shattered his world with her betrayal and who now knelt before him, begging for mercy, her pleas falling on deaf ears. You were everything to me, Melissa, he said, tears finally breaking free, streaming down his face, carving glistening tracks through the mask of anger and resentment. You were my heart, my soul, the reason I woke up every morning. And you killed me long before I ever picked up this gun, you destroyed me with your lies and your deceit, you left me a hollow shell of the man I once was. The shot rang out, deafening in the suddenly silent room, its sound echoing through the house like a death knell. A scream ripped through the air, a primal expression of horror and grief, as Melissa's body jolted backward, the force of the bullet sending her collapsing onto the carpet in a heap. The blue fabric of her maternity dress bloomed dark with blood, spreading rapidly across the delicate fabric, a gruesome flower of crimson death blossoming before their eyes. She clutched her stomach instinctively, her hands stained with her own lifeblood, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief before they clouded over, the light fading from her gaze as she slipped into the darkness. Guests erupted in chaos, their composure shattering in an instant. Shrieks and wails filled the air, a cacophony of fear and despair, as bodies rushed frantically toward the door, seeking to escape the scene of carnage. A glass dish, knocked from a nearby table in the pandemonium, shattered on the floor, its fragments mingling with the blood and tears, a forgotten casualty of the tragedy. Someone shouted to call 911, but the words were drowned out by the overwhelming panic, lost in the sea of fear and desperation. Children cried, their innocent sobs piercing through the clamor and chaos, a heartbreaking lament that underscored the tragedy of the moment, their cries a poignant reminder of the innocence that had been shattered on this day. Mothers, their hearts breaking with grief and terror, scooped up their children and fled into the sunlight, seeking to shield them from the horrors they had witnessed and to escape the scene of carnage that had unfolded before their eyes. Jordan stood frozen in place, his body paralyzed by shock and disbelief, his phone slipping from his trembling hand and clattering to the ground, the device that had been used to unleash such destruction now lying discarded and forgotten. He stared at Melissa's still form, his eyes wide with horror, his face etched with a profound sense of guilt and regret, the weight of his actions crushing him under its immense burden. His voice was a whisper, broken and barely audible, almost childlike in its vulnerability. I just wanted her to choose me, he stammered, his words laced with anguish, a desperate attempt to justify the events that had led to this horrific outcome. David lowered the gun slowly, his movements mechanical and devoid of any emotion, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. He looked at his wife lying on the floor, the woman he had built his life with, the woman carrying the child he had prayed for, and all he saw was silence, a profound and all-encompassing emptiness that stretched out before him like a vast and desolate wasteland. The rage that had consumed him, driving him to commit such an unspeakable act, drained from him as quickly as water from a cracked vessel, leaving behind only a hollow void, a sense of utter devastation that threatened to swallow him whole. His knees buckled beneath him, unable to support the weight of his guilt and despair, and he sank to the floor beside her, the pistol slipping from his lifeless hand with a dull thud, a symbol of the life he had destroyed and the future he had forfeited. As he knelt beside Melissa's lifeless body, the sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, their mournful sound signaling the arrival of the authorities and the beginning of a long and painful journey through the criminal justice system, a journey that would forever alter the course of his life and leave him haunted by the memory of the day the baby shower turned into a bloodbath. He reached out his trembling hand, his fingertips brushing against the soft strands of her hair, a final gesture of tenderness and regret, and whispered through his tears, his voice barely audible above the wailing sirens. "I just wanted the truth, Melissa, that's all I ever wanted. But it killed me, it destroyed everything I ever loved." By the time the wailing sirens grew louder, their mournful sound piercing the air, the baby shower had been irrevocably transformed from a scene of joy and anticipation into one of unspeakable horror and devastating tragedy. The pastel decorations, once symbols of hope and new beginnings, still hung limply on the walls, their cheerful colors now a cruel mockery of the devastation that had unfolded. The elaborately decorated cake, a centerpiece of the celebration, sat untouched on the table, its sugary sweetness a stark contrast to the bitterness of the events that had transpired. But the heart of the celebration was gone, extinguished in a single thunderous shot that had shattered the lives of everyone involved, leaving behind a void that could never be filled. And David, broken and hollow, sat amidst the wreckage of what had once been his family, his world reduced to a pile of shattered dreams and haunting memories. For a fleeting heartbeat, an eerie silence blanketed the room, a thick and suffocating stillness that hung heavy in the air, the kind of silence that descends after a lightning strike, a moment of suspended animation before the thunder roars and the full force of the storm is unleashed. Melissa's body lay still and lifeless on the floor, her once beautiful maternity dress soaked dark with blood, her hand limp and lifeless over the swell of her belly, a tragic testament to the promise of new life that had been so cruelly extinguished. Then the storm broke, unleashing a torrent of grief, fear, and despair. Screams erupted from the throats of the assembled guests, piercing and raw, a primal expression of the horror they had witnessed. Chairs toppled over as people scrambled frantically for the door, desperate to escape the scene of carnage, their shoes slipping on the spilled punch and shattered glass, the remnants of a celebration that had been forever tainted by violence and death. A mother, her face etched with terror, clutched her toddler tightly to her chest, shielding his innocent eyes from the gruesome sight before them as she pushed her way through the chaotic crowd, desperate to protect her child from the horrors they had witnessed. Someone accidentally knocked over the cake stand, sending the three-tiered confection crashing to the floor with a sickening thud, the once beautiful creation now a mangled mess of frosting, sponge, and broken dreams. The sweet, sugary frosting smeared across the carpet like a grotesque parody of celebration, a macabre reminder of the joy that had been so brutally extinguished. Neighbors who had come to toast new life and to share in the happiness of the expectant parents now fled from death, their faces etched with fear and disbelief, their hearts heavy with sorrow and regret. The cheerful balloons, their pastel colors a stark contrast to the grim reality below, bobbed gently above the carnage, their innocence swaying a cruel mockery of the terror and despair that had engulfed the room. Jordan stood frozen in the middle of it all, a statue of guilt and remorse, his face pale and contorted with anguish, his body trembling uncontrollably. His phone, the instrument of such destruction, lay discarded at his feet, the damning images of his affair with Melissa still glowing faintly across the cracked screen, a constant reminder of the role he had played in the tragedy that had unfolded. His lips moved silently, whispering fragmented phrases that no one could hear, a desperate attempt to absolve himself of responsibility. "I didn't mean for this to happen, I didn't think it would go this far," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the sounds of chaos and despair. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his lungs struggling to draw in air, but his legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by a combination of fear, guilt, and disbelief. He stared at Melissa's lifeless body, his eyes wide with horror, as if willing her to rise from the dead, to laugh and tell him that it was all some horrible trick, a nightmare from which he would soon awaken. David, his face streaked with tears and blood, dropped to his knees beside his wife, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing the delicate contours of her cheek. Blood stained his palms, warm and shockingly real, a tangible reminder of the irreversible consequences of his actions. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, David Patterson understood the true meaning of loss, the profound and all-encompassing emptiness that follows the shattering of dreams and the destruction of love. "Melissa," he whispered, his voice a broken prayer, barely audible above the escalating chaos that engulfed the room. "Please don't leave me. I don't know what I'll do without you. Come back to me, I'm begging you." But her eyes remained unfocused, glazed over with the vacant stare of death, no longer registering his presence, no longer reflecting the love and warmth that had once defined their relationship. The sound of sirens grew closer, their mournful wail echoing through the suburban streets, growing louder with each passing second, a harbinger of the authorities who were about to descend upon the scene and begin the grim task of piecing together the events that had led to such a devastating outcome. Outside, neighbors spilled into their yards, their faces etched with a mixture of shock, horror, and morbid curiosity, some weeping openly, their hearts breaking for the family that had been torn apart, some shouting in disbelief and outrage, demanding answers for the senseless violence, while others dialed frantically on their phones, relaying the unfolding tragedy to friends, family, and the local news outlets. The world that had once envied the Carters' seemingly perfect house, their idyllic suburban life, now watched in horrified fascination as it burned from within, consumed by a firestorm of grief, anger, and despair. Inside, David sat slumped beside Melissa's lifeless body, his shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs, the pistol lying uselessly beside him, a symbol of the power he had wielded and the destruction he had wrought. He didn't resist when two burly men, their faces etched with pity and concern, tried to gently tug him away from Melissa's side, seeking to remove him from the scene of carnage. He didn't even look at them, his gaze fixed solely on his deceased wife, his eyes never leaving her face for even a moment. As if he were desperately trying to memorize every line, every contour, every detail of her features before the police would inevitably take him from her forever, before he would be forced to confront the reality that he had taken her life and destroyed his own. When the police officers finally burst through the front door, their weapons drawn, their faces grim and determined, they found a scene of utter devastation, a tableau of tragedy that would forever be seared into their memories. Guests huddled in corners, their bodies trembling with fear, their faces stained with tears, while children sobbed uncontrollably into their mothers' necks, seeking comfort and reassurance in the face of unimaginable horror. The remnants of the baby shower, the frosting and glass glittering ominously underfoot, served as a macabre reminder of the joy that had been extinguished and the innocence that had been lost. At the center of it all, amidst the chaos and carnage, was David Carter, his body covered in his wife's blood, a macabre stain that symbolized the irreversible act he had committed. His eyes were hollow and vacant, devoid of any emotion, reflecting a soul that was already condemned, lost in a sea of guilt, grief, and despair. He didn't fight or resist as the officers cuffed his hands behind his back, their touch cold and impersonal, a stark reminder of the consequences he now faced. He didn't protest his arrest, didn't beg for leniency, didn't offer any excuses for his actions. He simply whispered one last time, his voice barely audible, more to himself than to anyone else, a final acknowledgement of the devastation he had wrought. "It's over," he murmured, his words a chilling epitaph to a life that had been tragically cut short. As he was led outside, past the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles and the horrified faces of his neighbors, the baby shower decorations still clung precariously to the walls inside, their cheerful presence a cruel juxtaposition to the scene of carnage. Pastel streamers fluttered gently in the air-conditioned draft, their delicate movements mocking the violence that had taken place. Brightly colored balloons bobbed innocently, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded beneath them. Half-opened gifts, intended to celebrate the arrival of new life, lay scattered on the floor, their contents now a poignant reminder of what would never be. They were innocent and cruel reminders of what the day was supposed to be, a celebration of love, family, and new beginnings. And in the middle of the living room, beneath their fading glow, lay Melissa Carter, the woman who had wanted to be celebrated, the expectant mother who never got the chance to be one, her dreams and aspirations forever extinguished by a single act of violence. The courtroom in downtown Dallas was packed from the very first day of testimony, the public clamoring to witness the trial of David Carter, the man who had murdered his pregnant wife in cold blood, a crime that had captivated the nation and sparked a heated debate about love, betrayal, and the limits of human rage. Reporters from across the country filled the benches, their notepads and recording devices at the ready, eager to capture every detail of the sensational trial. Cameras flashed incessantly outside the courthouse, capturing the images of the key players in this tragic drama, their faces broadcasting the story of love, loss, and violence to a captivated audience. And the townspeople who had once attended Melissa Carter's baby shower, sharing in her joy and celebrating the upcoming arrival of her child, now lined up for seats in the courtroom, their faces etched with a mixture of grief, anger, and morbid curiosity, eager to witness the unraveling of a man who had once been considered a pillar of the community, a dependable and respectable figure in their midst. David Patterson entered the courtroom in shackles, his orange jumpsuit a far cry from the crisp, pressed shirts and quiet dignity that people remembered from his life before the tragedy. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his jaw clenched tightly as the deputies guided him to the defense table, his posture conveying a sense of shame and resignation. The whispers rippled through the courtroom instantly, the hushed voices a chorus of judgment and speculation. Neighbors pointed fingers, former friends shook their heads in disbelief and disapproval, and women clutched their purses tighter, as if the grief and horror that permeated the room might somehow spill onto them, contaminating their own lives. At the prosecution's table sat District Attorney Vanessa Mendoza, a formidable woman with a sharp gaze and a well-deserved reputation for dismantling defendants with surgical precision, dissecting their stories and exposing their lies with ruthless efficiency. She wasted no time in painting David Patterson as a cold-blooded killer, a man consumed by rage and driven to commit a heinous act of violence. This man, she declared in her opening statement, her voice steady and unwavering, commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom, executed his wife in cold blood, in front of her family, her friends, and even innocent children, shattering their lives forever and leaving a stain on this community that will never be erased. He took the life of a woman who was carrying their unborn child, a life that could have begun that very day, surrounded by love and joy, as a celebration of hope and new beginnings. Instead, he turned it into a scene of bloodshed and devastation, a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the destructive power of rage. No amount of betrayal, no matter how profound or humiliating, justifies the act of murder, the taking of another human life. Justice demands that he be held accountable for his actions. The defense, led by seasoned attorney Benjamin Cross, countered the prosecution's narrative with equal force and conviction. He leaned heavily on David Carter's history as a decorated veteran, a hard-working and devoted husband, and a man who had been publicly humiliated and betrayed in front of dozens of witnesses, arguing that his actions were not premeditated but rather the result of a sudden and uncontrollable emotional breakdown. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Cross told the panel, his voice resonating with sincerity and compassion, "this was not the act of a cold-blooded monster, a man devoid of empathy and remorse. It was the act of a man who had been broken, pushed past the limits of human endurance, driven to the brink of insanity by a single moment of devastating betrayal, a moment that shattered his world and robbed him of his reason. He snapped, his mind overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, and he acted impulsively, without thinking. That is not murder in the first degree, as the prosecution would have you believe. It is manslaughter, a crime committed in the heat of passion, a tragic consequence of a moment of uncontrollable rage." The testimony that followed was gut-wrenching and emotionally charged, as witnesses recounted the events of that fateful day, their words painting a vivid and disturbing picture of the tragedy that had unfolded at the Patterson home. Guests from the baby shower took the stand one by one, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted the laughter and joy that had abruptly soured into screams of terror and despair, the memories of the scene still fresh and raw in their minds. Mothers described the harrowing experience of clutching their children tightly to their chests, shielding them from the sight of the gun as it was raised, their protective instincts kicking in as they desperately tried to protect their innocent offspring from harm. Fathers spoke of dragging people out the door, their faces etched with fear and determination, as they sought to evacuate the scene and prevent further bloodshed. A cousin, her voice choked with sobs, broke down on the witness stand as she recounted the moment Melissa's body fell to the floor, the image of her lifeless form forever seared into her memory. The haunting sound of her scream, she testified, still reverberated in her mind, invading her sleep and transforming her dreams into nightmares. Then Melissa's older sister, Danielle, took the stand, her presence commanding respect and her words carrying the weight of immeasurable grief. She clutched a framed photograph of Melissa as a young bride, her face radiant with happiness, her eyes shining with hope and optimism, a poignant reminder of the life that had been so brutally extinguished. Danielle's voice trembled slightly, but her resolve remained unwavering as she began to speak, her words filled with both sorrow and righteous indignation. "My sister was finally getting the one thing she had prayed for her entire life," she declared, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "A child," Danielle continued, her voice resonating with emotion, her words carrying across the room and touching the hearts of everyone who was present. "She decorated the nursery with tiny, shimmering stars on the walls, creating a magical and enchanting space for her baby to grow. She picked out lullabies before the crib was even delivered, humming them softly to her belly, imagining the sweet melodies would soothe her child and lull him or her to sleep. She believed that this baby would heal everything that was broken in her life, filling the void in her heart and bringing her a sense of peace and fulfillment that she had longed for so long. And now," Danielle's voice cracked with emotion, "we visit her at a cold and desolate graveyard instead of a warm and welcoming nursery. Instead of holding her baby in our arms, cradling him or her with love and affection, I leave flowers and tie colorful balloons to a cold, lifeless headstone, a heartbreaking symbol of the life that was lost and the future that was stolen." She turned slowly toward David, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief, anger, and profound disappointment, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "You didn't just take Melissa from us, you didn't just rob us of her presence in our lives. You took our future, our hope, our joy, everything that made our family complete. You robbed us of the opportunity to meet the child we had already loved before he or she was even born, a child who would have brought so much happiness into our lives. You destroyed a family that trusted you, a family that welcomed you with open arms and loved you unconditionally. And for that, I will never forgive you." The courtroom was still and silent, heavy with grief and the weight of Danielle's powerful testimony, the atmosphere thick with sorrow and the unspoken condemnation of the man who had caused so much pain. Even the jurors, hardened by years of exposure to the darkest aspects of human nature, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes glistening with unshed tears, their faces reflecting the weight of the sorrow and grief that permeated the courtroom. The judge, a seasoned veteran of the legal system, recognized the profound impact of Danielle's words and allowed them to linger in the air, knowing that they spoke for every wound left unhealed, for every life irrevocably altered by the tragedy that had unfolded. And then came Jordan Hayes, the man whose actions had set the stage for the devastating events that followed. He walked slowly and deliberately to the witness stand, his movements hesitant and uncertain, his presence radiating a sense of unease. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, its ill-fitting fabric a reflection of his own discomfort, and the fact that he was out of place in this setting. His hands trembled visibly as he swore the oath, his voice barely audible above the hushed whispers of the courtroom. His face was pale and drawn, his features gaunt and hollow, conveying the haunted expression of a man consumed by guilt and remorse. When asked to recount what he had done, to describe the events that had led to Melissa's death, his voice cracked with emotion, his words choked with regret. I thought if I showed everyone the truth, if I exposed Melissa's lies, she'd finally choose me," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to end this way, I swear. I didn't think he would actually do it." His words trailed off into an awkward silence, his eyes glistening with tears, reflecting the pain and regret that consumed him. Prosecutor Mendoza, sensing an opportunity to capitalize on Jordan's vulnerability and to further solidify her case against David Carter, seized on him with ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice sharp and accusatory, "isn't it true that you flaunted those intimate messages and photographs in front of the entire room, exposing Melissa's infidelity to her family and friends in the most humiliating way possible? Isn't it true that you taunted Mr. Carter, knowing that your actions would inflict immense pain and suffering upon him, pushing him to the brink of despair? Jordan bowed his head, his shoulders slumping with shame. I was angry, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I wasn't thinking clearly. I let my emotions get the better of me. The jury watched intently, scrutinizing Jordan's every word and gesture, their faces reflecting a mixture of pity, disgust, and judgment. His presence in the affair was undeniable, his role in setting the stage for the tragedy clear, but it was ultimately David Patterson who had pulled the trigger, who had made the conscious decision to take Melissa's life. When it was David Carter's turn to testify, to finally tell his side of the story, the courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man who stood accused of such a heinous crime. He rose slowly from his seat, his movements stiff and deliberate, his face pale and gaunt from weeks of confinement and the weight of his own guilt. His hands gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles white with tension, as he prepared to face the scrutiny of the jury and the judgment of the world. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough and strained, but clear and unwavering, conveying a sense of raw honesty and profound remorse. I loved her, he began, his words laced with emotion. God help me, I loved her more than anything in the world. When I found out about the affair, when he showed those pictures to everyone, it was like the ground split open under me, swallowing everything I believed in, everything I held dear. I wasn't thinking clearly, I wasn't planning anything. I just snapped, my mind overwhelmed by a flood of anger and betrayal, and I can't take it back, no matter how much I wish I could. He broke down then, his carefully constructed composure crumbling under the weight of his grief and guilt, his shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs, tears streaming down his face, a public display of the anguish that consumed him. Some in the gallery wept with him, their hearts aching with sympathy for the man who had been driven to such despair, while others looked away, their faces hardened by the horror of what he had done, unable to offer him any compassion or understanding. After weeks of grueling testimony, the closing arguments came swift and heavy, each side presenting their final case to the jury with unwavering conviction. The prosecution insisted that David Patterson had a choice that day, that he could have walked away from the situation, could have sought a divorce, could have chosen any path other than the one that led to murder. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for understanding, for mercy, urging the jury to see the man's underlying humanity, to recognize the profound impact of the betrayal he had suffered, and to understand that his actions, while undeniably tragic, were the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, a terrible mistake that should not define the rest of his life. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, their faces inscrutable, their decision sealed, the room held its breath, suspended in a state of anxious anticipation. The foreman rose slowly from his seat, his voice steady and solemn as he prepared to deliver the verdict that would determine David Carter's fate. We, the jury, find the defendant, David Carter, guilty of murder in the first degree. The foreman declared, his voice devoid of any emotion, his words sealing David Carter's fate and sending shockwaves through the courtroom. The gavel struck the wooden block with a sharp, resounding crack, its sound echoing through the silent room, puncturing the weight of the verdict and benjamining the end of the trial. David's head dropped forward, his chin resting on his chest, his body slumping with defeat. His hands clenched into tight fists, his knuckles white with tension as he struggled to contain the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Gasps of shock and disbelief echoed through the courtroom, followed by a heart-wrenching sob from the back row, a poignant expression of grief and despair from someone who had once loved both David and Melissa, and who was now left with only the ashes of their shattered lives. The judge's voice rang clear and unwavering, delivering the sentence that would confine David Patterson to a life behind bars. You are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, he declared, his words carrying the full weight of the law. In that moment, the fate of the Patterson family was sealed, their lives forever benjamined by tragedy and loss. One life had been taken, stolen in a moment of senseless violence, and another was now condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars, haunted by the memory of the act that had destroyed his family and his future. and a community was left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy they had witnessed firsthand, struggling to make sense of the senseless violence, and to find a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. The words, "Life in prison without the possibility of parole," echoed in the courtroom long after the gavel had fallen silent, a haunting reminder of the consequences of violence, and the irreversible nature of death. For David Carter, it was less a sentence than a sealing of fate, a heavy weight that would forever press down on him, confining him to a life of regret and remorse. His shoulders sagged with the weight of his guilt, and for the first time since his arrest, his eyes closed in a gesture of complete resignation, as if he were finally surrendering to the inevitable. He didn't fight the verdict, didn't shout in protest, didn't offer any further explanations or justifications for his actions. He simply let the weight of his own choices crush him into silence, accepting his fate with a quiet despair. Behind him, the gallery shifted with emotion, the assembled spectators grappling with their own feelings of grief, anger, and disbelief, each one struggling to come to terms with the tragedy that had forever altered their community. Some wept openly, their hearts breaking with grief for Melissa, for the unborn child whose life had been tragically cut short, and for the future that had been stolen in a single, devastating gunshot. Others whispered about justice finally being served, their voices laced with a sense of satisfaction that David Patterson had been held accountable for his actions. But even in their calls for justice, there was an underlying current of sorrow and regret. But beneath the anger and the calls for justice, there was a heavy, lingering sorrow, a profound sense of loss that permeated the courtroom and touched the hearts of everyone who had been involved in the tragedy, directly or indirectly. No one had left this tragedy untouched, all had been affected in some way by the violence and the loss of life. Jordan Hayes sat near the back of the courtroom, his head buried in his hands, his body racked with sobs. The verdict was not his to carry in a legal sense, but the burden of guilt weighed heavily on his shoulders, gnawing at his conscience like a relentless parasite, consuming his thoughts and poisoning his soul. He had wanted love, wanted truth, wanted validation, a sense of worth and belonging that he had always craved. But instead, his reckless need for exposure, his selfish desire to reveal the truth and force Melissa to choose him, had lit the fuse that had ultimately destroyed everything, unleashing a chain of events that had led to such devastating consequences. He could not shake the haunting image of Melissa collapsing onto the floor, her lifeblood staining her dress, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Nor could he forget the image of David Carter's hollow face, his features contorted with rage and despair, as the gun smoked in his hand, the symbol of his irreversible act. Jordan's tears fell freely, unrestrained and inconsolable, as the full reality of his actions settled in, crushing him under its immense weight. He had not just lost Melissa, the woman he had claimed to love, he had helped bury her, his actions contributing directly to her death, and leaving him with a burden of guilt that he would carry for the rest of his life. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters shouted questions, their microphones shoved toward anyone willing to speak, eager to capture the raw emotions and personal stories that would fuel their news reports. Some neighbors condemned David Patterson as a cold-blooded murderer, their voices filled with anger and outrage, demanding that he be punished to the full extent of the law. Others, their voices trembling with emotion, admitted that they understood the humiliation and despair that had driven him to the brink, acknowledging the immense pressure he had been under and the devastating impact of Melissa's betrayal. The community that had once celebrated the Carters, admiring their seemingly perfect lives and sharing in their joys, was now irrevocably split apart, fractured by judgment, pity, and the lingering trauma of the tragedy they had witnessed. When the deputies led David Patterson away in chains, his orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of his fallen state, flashbulbs popped incessantly, illuminating his drawn and weary face, capturing the image of a man whose life had been shattered beyond repair. For a fleeting moment, he turned his eyes skyward, as if searching for forgiveness in a sky that would never answer, seeking solace in a higher power that seemed deaf to his pleas. The courthouse doors closed behind him with a finality that felt like a coffin sealing his fate and separating him from the world forever. Melissa's absence hung heavier than any verdict, a void that could never be filled, a constant reminder of the life that had been so cruelly extinguished. Her name, once spoken with warmth and affection, now carried the weight of scandal and loss, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had engulfed their community. The baby shower that should have been a joyous beginning, a celebration of new life and the promise of a brighter future, had become a chilling symbol of how betrayal, pride, and unchecked anger could unravel lives, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would never be forgotten. And as the crowd dispersed, the reporters filing their stories, the neighbors returning to their homes, and the lawyers preparing for their next cases, one truth remained etched in every heart, a somber realization that transcended the legal proceedings and the pronouncements of justice. Justice had been served, the legal system had run its course, and David Patterson had been held accountable for his actions. But no one had truly won, no one had emerged from the tragedy unscathed, and the pain and loss would continue to resonate for years to come. Years passed, but the memory of that fateful baby shower, the day that joy turned to horror, never left the town, lingering like a dark cloud over the community. The Patterson home, once painted in cheerful colors and filled with the sounds of laughter and love, now stood abandoned at the end of the cul-de-sac, a silent and haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The shutters sagged on their hinges, weathered by time and neglect, their faded paint peeling and cracking under the relentless sun. Weeds pushed their way through the cracks in the driveway, reclaiming the paved surface and transforming it into a tangled mass of green. And the porch swing, once a symbol of peaceful evenings and shared moments, creaked mournfully in the wind, its rhythmic sway a haunting reminder of the laughter and joy that had once filled the house, now sounding like the mournful lament of a ghost refusing to leave, forever tethered to the site of such tragedy. Neighbors walked by the abandoned home in silence, their heads bowed in respect and sorrow, their eyes averting the empty windows that seemed to stare back at them with a haunting gaze. They warned their children never to play near the house, instilling in them a sense of fear and unease, transforming the once welcoming home into a forbidden space, a place to be avoided at all costs. It had become a monument not of joy and celebration, but of ruin and despair, a stark reminder of the destructive power of human emotions and the irreversible consequences of violence. Melissa's name lived on in hushed conversations, whispered in tones of reverence and regret, her memory both cherished and tainted by the events that had led to her tragic demise. Her face, smiling serenely from old photographs tucked away in family albums, served as a bittersweet reminder of the life that had been so cruelly extinguished, a testament to the love and laughter that had once filled her days. Some remembered her as a loving and compassionate friend who always offered a kind word and a listening ear, a woman who had brought joy and warmth into their lives. Others, however, could not forget the choices she had made, the double life she had led, and the deceit and betrayal that had ultimately led to her violent death. Her unborn child, never given the chance to breathe, to experience the joys and sorrows of life, became a symbol of what was lost, the innocent casualty of pride, passion, and betrayal, a heartbreaking reminder of the future that would never be. David Patterson spent his days behind cold steel bars, his life reduced to a monotonous routine of confinement and regret. The clamor of prison doors slamming shut, the harsh and unforgiving sound echoing through the sterile corridors, had replaced the gentle hum of cicadas he had once heard from his back porch, the sounds of nature now replaced by the cacophony of prison life. Inmates whispered about him in hushed tones, their voices filled with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and morbid fascination. Some mocked him, cruelly labeling him the baby shower killer, reveling in his downfall and treating him with disdain. Others, sensing the darkness that surrounded him, kept their distance from the quiet, haunted man who rarely spoke, recognizing the pain and anguish that consumed him and wary of the violence that lay dormant beneath his stoic exterior. He had no visitors, no friends, no family left to lean on, his isolation complete and absolute. His only companions were the ghosts of his past, the haunting memories of the life he had destroyed. Each night he lay on the thin, uncomfortable prison mattress and replayed that fateful moment over and over again in his mind, trapped in an endless loop of regret and despair. He saw Melissa's face, contorted with terror and disbelief, he heard the desperate plea in her voice as she begged him to stop, and he relived the deafening sound of the gun firing, the moment that had changed everything forever. And every morning he woke to the same crushing truth, the inescapable realization that he had destroyed the very life he had wanted to protect, that he had taken the life of the woman he had loved and the child he had longed for, and that he would now spend the rest of his days paying the price for his actions. Jordan Hayes, though free from the physical confines of prison, carried his own sentence, a burden of guilt and remorse that weighed heavily on his soul. He left town soon after the trial, unable to face the accusing eyes of the community, the faces that branded him as the man who had sparked the tragedy, the catalyst who had set the stage for such devastating violence. He drifted from city to city, a wanderer without a home, unable to settle down, unable to escape the haunting memories of Melissa's last breath, the image forever seared into his mind. In quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he admitted to himself what he had never been able to confess in court, the truth that lay buried beneath layers of self-deception and rationalization. It wasn't love that had driven him to expose the affair, to publicly humiliate Melissa and David and shatter their lives. It was pride, a selfish and corrosive desire to assert his own worth, to prove that he was worthy of Melissa's love, and to punish her for her betrayal. And it had cost them everything, leaving behind a legacy of pain, loss, and regret that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The community learned its own harsh lesson from the tragedy, a somber realization that shattered their illusions of perfection and forced them to confront the complexities of human relationships. For years, they had celebrated the Carters as the perfect couple, the epitome of suburban bliss, the kind of marriage that everyone aspired to achieve. But perfection, they realized, was often just a mask, a carefully constructed facade that concealed the hidden struggles, the unspoken resentments, and the simmering tensions that lay beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, in the privacy of their own homes, people wrestled with loneliness, betrayal, and secrets, the hidden struggles that no amount of cheerful balloons or brightly colored ribbons could ever truly cover up. The tragedy of the Patterson family became a story told to new families moving into the town, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones, not as a form of malicious gossip, but as a warning about the dangers of unchecked emotions and the importance of honesty and communication. At Melissa's grave, fresh flowers still appeared now and then, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber surroundings, a silent tribute to the life that had been lost and the love that had been extinguished. No one ever admitted to leaving them, the identity of the anonymous benefactor shrouded in mystery and speculation. Some whispered that it was Jordan Hayes, returning to the town in the shadows of the night, his heart burdened by guilt and remorse, to beg for forgiveness from a woman who could no longer hear his pleas. Others believed it was an old friend of Melissa's, someone who couldn't bear to let her memory fade, someone who sought to honor the life that had been cut short and to keep her spirit alive. But whoever it was, they always left a single pink balloon tied to the headstone, bobbing gently in the Texas breeze, its delicate presence a poignant reminder of the day that was meant for celebration but had instead become a memorial, a somber commemoration of a life lost and a future stolen. The lesson of the Patterson family was forever etched into the town's collective memory, a grim reminder of the destructive power of human emotions and the irreversible consequences of violence. Betrayal, fueled by pride and unchecked rage, could destroy more than just the guilty. It could wipe out innocence, silence futures, and shatter entire communities, leaving behind a legacy of pain and regret that would last for generations. Love, twisted by secrecy and pride, had become a deadly poison, consuming everything in its path and leaving behind a trail of devastation that could never be fully erased. And so the story lived on, passed down from generation to generation, not just as a fleeting headline in a newspaper, not just as a sensationalized courtroom drama, but as a chilling reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the destructive power of unchecked emotions. The line between devotion and destruction, the delicate balance between love and obsession, is thinner than anyone dares to believe, a lesson learned through tragedy and etched in the memory of a town forever scarred. Years later, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Wilkins sat on her porch, her frail body hunched over in a rocking chair, as a new family moved into the cul-de-sac, their arrival stirring up long-dormant memories. Their children, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement, pointed tentatively at the long-abandoned Patterson home, its windows dark and lifeless, its shutters sagging and broken, a stark contrast to the other well-maintained houses on the street. One of the children, a young girl with wide, inquisitive eyes, turned to her mother and asked, "Mommy, why does that house look so sad? Why doesn't anyone live there?" Mrs. Whitfield, hearing the child's innocent question, leaned forward in her rocking chair, her voice low but steady, carrying the weight of years of memory and regret. "Because once, a long time ago, that house was filled with balloons and laughter, filled with the joy of a baby shower, a celebration of new life and the promise of a brighter future. But that joy died in a single gunshot, a moment of madness that shattered everything. Now, the house remembers every scream, every tear, every drop of blood, forever haunted by the tragedy that unfolded within its walls." The children fell silent, their wide eyes fixed on the weathered and dilapidated home, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and fascination. Mrs. Wilkins looked down the street, her gaze heavy with years of sorrow and regret, her heart aching with the memories of what had been lost. "Let this be a lesson to you, children," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustling of the leaves. "Love without truth will poison you, consuming everything in its path and leaving behind only destruction and despair. Always be honest with those you love, and never let pride or anger cloud your judgment, for the consequences can be devastating. Anger without mercy will destroy you, consuming your soul and leaving you a hollow shell of your former self. And together, those poisonous forces can turn even the happiest day, a day meant for celebration and joy, into a graveyard, a place of sorrow and regret, where dreams are buried and lives are forever scarred." The wind rustled gently through the trees, carrying her somber words into the fading Texas dusk, a haunting reminder that some tragedies never truly fade, that they linger in the collective memory of a community, shaping the lives of those who remain and serving as a cautionary tale for future generations. They only become warnings, whispered from one generation to the next, a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked human emotions.